Bosho Nikanek, Ani Jayek. I hope you're having a wonderful day and welcome back to our Braiding Sweetgrass series. I believe we're on part 3, so welcome. Now before we get started, I want you to make sure you're in a comfortable place. You've got your breathing down, you're nice and relaxed, maybe smudged before we begin. And so our hearts and our spirits are in a good place. I can tell you right now, this goes into some difficult issues as far as the Indian Removal Act and boarding schools and removal. So if you need to pause this video so that you can go smudge and get grounded, then please do so now and then just come back. We'll wait. Okay, so I'm going to start by doing a little reading. And this starts on page 12. The word pecan, the fruit of the tree known as the pecan hickory, comes to English from indigenous languages. Pigan is a nut, any nut. The hickories, black walnuts, and butternuts of our northern homelands have their own specific names, but those trees, like the homelands, were lost to my people. Our lands around Lake Michigan were wanted by settlers, so in long lines, surrounded by soldiers, we were marched at gunpoint along what became known as the Trail of Death. They took us to a new place, far from our lakes and forests, but someone wanted that land too, so the bedrolls were packed again, thinner this time. In the span of a single generation, my ancestors were removed 3 times. Wisconsin to Kansas, points in between, and then to Oklahoma. I wonder if they looked back for a last glimpse of the lakes, glimmering like a mirage. Did they touch the trees in remembrance as they became fewer and fewer until there was only grass? So much was scattered and left along the trail. Graves of half the people, language, knowledge, names. My great-grandmother, Shenote, wind blowing through, was renamed Charlotte. Names the soldiers or the missionaries could not pronounce were not permitted. When they got to Kansas, they must have been relieved to find groves of nut trees along the rivers, a type unknown to them, but delicious and plentiful. Without a name for this new food, they just called them nuts, pecan, which became pecan in English. So you can see how that was pretty deep, talking about the Indian Removal Act. And there was more than one trail of death. There were several. And then there was all the trails the other nations had to take when they were forcefully removed. So many of our ancestors were buried along the way, or belongings had to be dropped so that they could keep walking. Babies were born on the trail, and babies were buried on the trail. So much was lost. And I love, though, that Robin, the author of this book, is able to put into words what our hearts are feeling, what our spirits are telling us, what our ancestors are whispering in our ears. So you can kind of see and feel the emotion come up just from that small passage. My 3 times great-grandparents walked the Trail of Death. And my 3 times grandfather, Pierre Navarre, he was descendants of the Ojibwe and Peter Navarre, who's French. They were French traders. He was told he didn't need to leave on the walk, but his wife and children would have to. But since he was only half native, he didn't have to walk, and because he had this line tying him to French royalty, he wouldn't have to walk. He chose to walk anyway. He walked with his family. He wasn't going to leave them, which gives me hope and strength for the men in my family. And then his wife, Keshnekwe, which means afternoon woman, he walked with her, and they were very much in love. Now, I don't know where Keshnekwe died, and I don't know if I get conflicting reports that she died on the trail or shortly after arriving in Kansas. But either way, she died right around that time, and I don't know where she's buried. Now, Keshnekwe was forced to take on an English Christian name on the trail as well, and that name is Angelique. And I can't find any signs of Angelique or Keshnekwe, but I'm thankful that I know her name. Now I want to share with you a story that I have about historical trauma that I didn't know was there. So if you're experiencing some emotion or grief that comes up, it's historical trauma, and it's okay, let's work it because we're feeling it. But I found that Pierre Navarre, my 3 times grandfather, was buried at Notre Dame in the cemetery there. And my daughter she was there giving a speech on an Anishinaabe textile that she had, with collaboration, had rehydrated and could see the woven fibers and the love that went into a very intricate band, probably made from flax or something like that. Anyway, so she is there giving this speech about how she has discovered and preserved this piece of an Anishinaabe fiber formed by another Anishinaabe woman probably 500 years in the past. She's doing that at Notre Dame, and I'm wandering around the cemetery looking to see if I could find Pierre Navarre's grave, and I never did find it. And I never did find Keshnekwe's either. But then I found out that the land I was walking on was actually Keshnekwe's allotment before the removal. So I was on my grandparents' land before they were forcefully removed. And I felt connection, but such deep sorrow at the same time. Now another year passes, and my daughter wasn't with me, I'm sorry. It was my husband and my son. We went back so that I could try to find Pierre Navarre's grave. We still couldn't find it, but while we're wandering through, I found this mound, just a big mound, and it's surrounded by Christian graves. But I was drawn to this mound, and I get closer, and there's a little plaque on it, and it said, basically it was a mound of Potawatomi bodies that had been moved from their sacred burial spot around Elkhart, Indiana. It's close to Notre Dame, and had to be moved for a subdivision or something. So they moved our ancestors from their sacred place into this, almost just thrown into a mound in the middle of my grandmother's allotted land that she was removed from, and then surrounded by Christian burial, like super close, almost in a disrespectful way on top of it, and then with a little plaque. And I fell to my knees. I was so overwhelmed with grief and sorrow, and it was deep. It came from a place within my heart and my soul I didn't realize was there. So luckily in my car I carry sema, tobacco, and sage wherever I go, and I burned it and I left it for my ancestors, and I let my tears fall into the earth for them. So that's what I mean by historical trauma that you may not know is even there until you're reunited with something that brings it up. And it's something that's with us, we carry with us, whether it's in our blood, our DNA, our spirit memory, or whatever, but it's there. So when you feel it, just feel it. Let your tears come to the earth and feed our ancestors. Burn your sema, leave it. Have your sage and burn it and leave it. And pay homage to our ancestors, because they went through so much to make sure that we survived. And many of them laid down their lives so that we would survive. Okay, I'm going to move on now. So I took some time, I saged, I feel good. So I'm moving on. I hope that you all have this book by now and you can read along with me, and maybe you've gone farther than I have. Because I'm not reading everything because I want you to buy the book. And I don't get paid for this, so this is just like a book club. So I'm on page 1617 now, if you're following along. The federal government's Indian removal policies wrenched many Native people from our homelands. It separated us from our traditional knowledge and life ways, the bones of our ancestors, our sustaining plants, but even this did not extinguish identity. So the government tried a new tool, separating children from their families and cultures, sending them far away to school, long enough, they hoped, to make them forget who they were. Throughout Indian Territory, there are records of Indian agents being paid a bounty for rounding up kids to ship to the government boarding schools. Later, in a pretense of choice, the parents had to sign papers to let their children go, quote, legally, end quote. Parents who refused to go to jail. Some may have hoped it would give their children a better future than a Dust Bowl farm. Sometimes federal rations, weevily flour and rancid lard that were supposed to replace the buffalo, would be withheld until the children were signed over. Ooh, I don't know if you can hear that, but the thunder beings are outside talking. So this is talking about residential schools and the roundup of children. Children, language, lands, almost everything was stripped away. Stolen when you weren't looking because you were trying to stay alive. In the face of such loss, one thing our people could not surrender was the meaning of land. In the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything. Identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. Our lands were where our responsibility to the world was enacted, sacred ground. It belonged to itself. It was a gift, not a commodity, so it could never be bought or sold. These are the meanings people took with them when they were forced from their ancient homelands to new places. Whether it was their homeland or the new land forced upon them, land held in common gave people strength. It gave them something to fight for. And so, in the eyes of the federal government, that belief was a threat. Now, most of us have stories or have heard stories or have links to residential schools, whether it was ourselves that we were put in residential schools or our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. Thankfully, my mother and I did not have to go to a residential school, but that is because my grandfather, my mom's father, was put into a residential school. I don't have much information because he's already passed, and you know, like so many of us, I took for granted the time I had with him, and I didn't ask the right questions in the right way. He didn't talk about residential school. The only thing I remember him saying, and here's some background first. When his mother, my great-grandmother, when my grandfather was 6 years old, my great-grandmother, his mother, died. And that is when and how he was taken to be put into a residential school. I don't know which school. I believe it was probably Sacred Heart in Kansas because that's where he lived. The only thing he would say was that he wished he could remember the last time he saw his mother. And that for some reason he couldn't remember that anymore after going to school. So he just wouldn't talk about it, and I didn't know how to ask properly. So if there's any youth here listening, go talk to your elders, go talk to your grandparents, go talk to your great-grandparents if they're still with you, and try to ask the right questions. Do it in a sacred way. Maybe even take them a tobacco tie, a pouch of tobacco. That's the most sacred way you can ask an elder for information. Don't forget to take your SEMA. Okay, so we're moving on. I want to finish by this passage on page 21. Now, 2 generations later, after removal, after allotment, after the boarding schools, after diaspora, my family returns to Oklahoma, to what is left of my grandfather's allotment. From the hilltop, you can still see pecan groves along the river. At night we dance on the old powwow grounds. The ancient ceremonies greet the sunrise. The smell of corn soup and the sound of drums fill the air as the 9 bands of Potawatomi, scattered across the country by this history of removal, come together again for a few days each year and search for belonging. The Potawatomi gathering of nations reunites the people, an antidote to the divide and conquer strategy that was used to separate our people from each other and from our homelands. The synchrony of our gathering is determined by our leaders, but more importantly, there is something like a mycorrhizal network that unites us, an unseen connection of history and family and responsibility to both our ancestors and our children. As a nation, we are beginning to follow the guidance of our elders, the Pecans, by standing together for the benefit of all. We are remembering what they said, that all flourishing is mutual. Now, I thought about going a little bit farther. The next chapter talks about the heart of strawberries, and I was going to combine these two, but now I think we should keep them separate because I feel like the removal is deep and we need to allow time for that to sit and have some meditation and give it the respect that it deserves. And then next we'll be moving on to the heart strawberry and why we don't sell our medicine and why. And so I think it would be a disservice if I lump them both together. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I think this was a good deep one. I only got the tissues out once. So hopefully you all have your books. I really wanna know what you're thinking, so drop some comments. I do look at them. And I am also on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram if you wanna send me direct messages so that the public doesn't see. I'll try to figure out a way to put that in the comments so that you can see what those handles are, and so that I'm easier to find and we can communicate. But I really want to know what you all think about this because I feel like we all have our own experiences and our own stories. So my story and my experience and even my grief and sorrow are not going to be yours. So your perspective might allow other people to get back onto their road of healing and reconciliation and to get back home. I hope that makes sense. So with that, I'm going to leave you. This was deep and it was really good, and we have a storm outside, so the thunder beings were speaking to us at the same time. So I think this felt really good this time. I hope you're all feeling the same thing. Hope you have a wonderful day, and we will talk to you soon. Mno Gizget, Bamapi. For every Indigenous Author Monday video that I put out, I am dedicating it to the One Shelf Project put on by Gadakana. Gadakana is an Indigenous organization, a 501c3 nonprofit tax-deductible organization that provides books in their local libraries that are actually accurate, historically accurate, and by Indigenous authors, both fiction and nonfiction. And their goal is to at least have a shelf dedicated to Indigenous accurate information in their local libraries. They can only do this with help through donors, and they need your help. I will put the link down here, so please check them out. The One Shelf Project, another organization near and dear to my heart. Gedakana.